The Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the Biden administration, allowing for US Border Patrol agents to remove razor wire that was installed along the southern border by Texas officials. Now, the decision indicates that the wire can be taken down until the legality of the very barriers is actually resolved in court. So this was an emergency decision, and since it was an emergency decision, basically the majority did not explain its reasoning for basically dissolving an order from a lower court. The dissenting judges were Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh. Now, at the heart of the fight between Texas and the Biden administration is Governor Greg Abbott's Operation Lone Star. And so the razor wire along the border is certainly part of that, but there are broader issues at play, other elements of Operation Lone Star that the Biden administration is having issues with, to say the least. So for instance, Abbott has mobilized thousands of National Guard troops and basically lined the banks of the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass with razor wire to try to block illegal entries into the country. And then in addition to the wire barriers, the Texas governor has also shepherded a new state law that would allow for local police agencies to literally detain people that they suspect of being in the country illegally in order to move to deport them. And both the Justice Department and the ACLU have basically sued Texas to block these laws from taking effect. Now, how did this case regarding the razor wire came to be? Well, according to the Washington Post, Texas initiated the lawsuit against the Biden administration last year to prevent agents from removing or cutting the wire barriers, which the federal government says prevents the agents from reaching migrants who have already entered the United States territory. Under US immigration law, anyone who reaches US soil has the right to seek asylum here. Now, after Texas filed this lawsuit against the Biden administration for wanting to take down the razor wire, a district court judge sided with Texas, finding that the barriers limit illegal crossings, which impose costs on the state of Texas. But the lower court denied the state's request to block Border Patrol agents from accessing the international border or disturbing the barrier while litigation continued. Texas appealed that ruling to the Fifth Circuit, which issued a temporary order prohibiting Border Patrol from interfering with the razor wire or damaging and moving the barriers. And then the Biden administration's like, okay, then we're going to ask the Supreme Court to weigh on this and issue an emergency order. The Supreme Court order reversing the conservative US Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit does not address Texas's more recent move to basically seize control of a riverfront park in Eagle Pass, and they deny the Border Patrol access to a section of the border there. So there are still huge questions about this, and it's still pending, decisions by the lower courts. The Biden administration cited Texas's takeover of border access in asking the court to expedite its review of the case, but it did not specifically challenge the state's action regarding park access. That element of the dispute remains unresolved. In filing their response, Texas officials said they were unaware of the Border Patrol's ongoing need to access the area and were investigating the claim. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton urged the Supreme Court not to intervene before the Fifth Circuit has an opportunity to fully consider the case, which is scheduled for argument on February 7th. And on that, basically allowing for Border Patrol to access the border, they have not weighed in on that. So we're gonna wait and see what the decision will be by the lower courts on February 7th. But the reactions to this, especially from those on the right, has been pretty amazing, because it mostly, here's a good way of summing it up, just ignore the Supreme Court. The deeply conservative Supreme Court, which in this case was like, look, the federal government is tasked with dealing with immigration. You can't, let's just let this play out in the courts. But for now, we're gonna allow Border Patrol to, if they need to access certain portions of the border, we're gonna allow them to interfere with the razor wire.
Yeah, so look, there's two different issues here. There's the ignoring the Supreme Court, which we'll get to more in a second, because this is an uneven battlefield as usual. So when the Supreme Court rules against the left and says women no longer have a right to control their own bodies, well, the left complies with the Supreme Court, right? And so if Texas takes away the right to an abortion, nobody goes and commits violence or draws guns and has a federal government versus a state government, et cetera, right? But the right wing, when the Supreme Court rules against them, goes, just ignore them, who cares? So we can't have a country like that. And then secondly, in terms of the main issue that Ana talked about, this is not a hard case. Federal government over state government, we resolved this hundreds of years ago. The federal government wins. So the state government cannot say to the federal government, you can't control the border. We're gonna put up barbed wire. What if they said, okay, it's not just barbed wire, we're gonna set up Gatling guns, the ones that go around like this, like the giant machine guns, and we're just gonna mow them all down and murder them all. And the federal government, no, you can't do that. That's a violation of federal law. They go, no, so what? We'll turn a Gatling gun. This is insanity. This is insanity. Federal government is above the state government. They get to control the border. Not even close to an issue. How those 4 justices justified this is it's just totally nuts. So what, every state can just tell the federal government to just go away and we'll just do whatever we want, and if there's a disagreement, we'll draw guns on each other?
So it does bring up an interesting question though, Cenk, because I did wonder about this, and I don't know the answer, but I'm curious what you think. So the argument that Texas is making is, well, we should be able to control the immigration situation that's impacting our state. At the same, and so I understand why the Supreme Court would want to allow US Border Patrol to interfere with that razor wire, because the razor wire in some cases is interfering with the job they need to do. But at the same time, think about states that had declared themselves sanctuary states during the beginning of the Trump administration. So couldn't the same argument be made that no, as a state, you don't get to make that decision. The federal government is more powerful and supersedes any legislation or law that has been implemented by the state?
Yeah, no, here's a giant difference. I hear what you're saying, and you're not wrong to be concerned, and we've got to make sure that we're consistent and not hypocritical. But in the sanctuary states, or cities, what they're basically saying is, the federal government wants me to be proactive in law enforcement. And so to go round up people, I don't think that's a good use of my resources, because I'm worried about murder and rape and all the different crimes that are happening. Second of all, the federal government tells me that in those cases that Ana's talking about, when you've got a Republican president, et cetera, that if I have a rape victim that came in and was brave enough to testify, that if I have to check into her immigration status and then deport her if I find out that she's undocumented. Well, I don't have the resource for that, et cetera, to be proactive. On the other hand, if the federal government came in and said, those are undocumented immigrants and we're here to seize them, and California or San Francisco was like, no, you're not, and drew guns, no, that's insane. The federal government supersedes the state government. If they want to do law enforcement within the state, they have a right to do that. But they don't have the right necessarily to force local law enforcement to do certain things. Look, by the way, that'll create problems in the red states too, but still consistent on proactive versus interfering with the federal government actually doing its job.
So let's talk a little bit about the reaction to the decision in this emergency, Supreme Court ruling. Let's fast forward to graphic 5 here. So Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton criticized the Supreme Court's order, saying that the destruction of Texas's border barriers will not help enforce the law or keep American citizens safe. This fight is not over. And it is true, this fight is not over. It's still being adjudicated by the lower courts. Other Republicans, though, went much further, including Republican Congressman Clay Higgins of Louisiana. He thinks that the Supreme Court decision should be ignored because Democrats are allegedly planning a civil war. My thoughts are that the feds are staging a civil war and Texas should stand their ground.
Lunatic, and this guy's a United States representative. Total, should be locked up in an insane asylum.
But he's not the only one. You also have Chip Roy, another Republican congressman from the state of Texas, who urges Texas to ignore the Supreme Court ruling. They have a duty under the Constitution and every other norm of leadership of any sovereign state to protect your citizens, period, full stop. There is no exception to that. And if the Supreme Court wants to ignore that truth, which a slim majority did, Texas still had the duty, Texas leaders still have the duty to defend their people.
Yeah, that's nonsense. Let me explain why that's nonsense. You just saying that someone has a constitutional duty doesn't mean that you're right. The job of the Supreme Court is to figure out what is and is not constitutional. So that's like your opinion, man. And there's nobody better to state that than me, because I've got a constitutional issue that you guys might have heard about. And if I said, you know what, I don't care what the federal government says or what the courts say. I feel like my constitutional interpretation is right and I got a duty to enforce it. So I'm gonna go to the White House and I'm gonna take control over the White House. That's not a thing, guys. So that's like your opinion, man. The courts decide, and oftentimes the right-wing courts decide against us on the left. And that's called life in the big city, okay? We don't get to usurp the power of the federal government and the Supreme Court because we had a different interpretation of the Constitution, even if we're right, as I am, but they're not.
Now, Border Patrol is saying that they are not planning to use this order as a green light to take down all, like, guys, we're talking about Border Patrol. Like, I can't believe we're now living in a world where Border Patrol isn't extreme enough for the right wing, but that's literally what's happening here. Border Patrol is arguing like, no, we're not gonna do away with all the razor wire. It's just that there's some razor wire that we might need to interfere with in order to do our jobs, and that's what we're gonna disturb. But like, I don't know, I get the sense that Border Patrol isn't like itching to do away with the razor wire. It's just that in some cases, it has interfered with some of the work that they're supposed to be doing. And look, the other thing is we do have a broken immigration system. There is no question about that. And I'm just frustrated because I understand where not the extreme members of the Texas government, but some of the people living in Texas, I can understand the frustration they're feeling because a lot of these border states, a lot of these border towns do bear the brunt of our broken immigration system. But fighting with the federal government is not gonna solve it. It's just gonna muck up the situation in the courts, while the real issue is the obstruction taking place in Congress as we speak in regard to passing much needed immigration reform.
Yeah, look, there's two answers here that are relatively inexpensive as opposed to trying to put thousands of Border Patrol guys and Texas Patrol and all these guys all along this enormous border, which is undoable. They've put as many people as they possibly can there, and the people are still pouring in record numbers. So what's it realistic about it? The whole thing that you hear about supply and demand is almost always true in these situations. If you can cut off the supply, you're in way better shape. Like the people that are flowing in. So how do you do that? I argue for a Marshall Plan, right? Marshall Plan for Latin America. And people go, oh my God, you're gonna spend money. Well, we spend way more money for war in Israel, Ukraine. The defense budget is the most bloated thing you've ever seen. A fraction, tiny fraction of that money could make a world of difference and have people stay in their homes. They want to stay in their homes. Nobody wants to leave their family and friends. They do it because they're desperate. We could fix that situation with a small amount of money and a ton more judges to handle asylum cases quicker so that folks don't come into the country and create the problems that we have now. So if you're frustrated, you're not wrong. And if the left says it's not a big deal, that's not the right way to go, okay? But there has to be a better, more thoughtful, more efficient answer than, okay, let's just line up thousands of guys and barbed wires along the border. It's a solution that we already know doesn't work.
Hey, thanks for watching that video. We really appreciate it, guys. And we appreciate it if you become members because that allows us to be independent, honest, progressive, all the things that you don't get from corporate media. And all of that is because of you guys. Hit the join button below and become one of us, become a Young Turk.